The first thing my husband said after handing my inheritance to another woman was, "You don't understand how investments work." The courtroom went silent. Across the room, his mistress smiled without a trace of guilt. She wore the emerald necklace my grandmother had left me, the one she always said should stay with the women in our family because it carried more memories than jewels. My husband didn't even glance at me. He looked at the judge with the confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. I closed my eyes for a second and remembered the afternoon my grandfather warned me that greed never arrives looking like greed. It arrives dressed as love, opportunity, or family. If you're enjoying this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave your country or city in the comments. And if stories about betrayal, patience, and justice are your kind of stories, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. 3 years earlier, I thought I'd married the kindest man I'd ever met. Ethan wasn't wealthy when we met. Neither was I. We built our life in a modest townhouse with squeaky floors, mismatched furniture, and dreams that always seemed just one promotion away. He used to kiss my forehead before work every morning and tell me that one day we'd laugh about how hard those years had been. I believed every word. When my grandfather Arthur passed away, I didn't think about money. I thought about the afternoons we'd spent fishing together, the terrible jokes he repeated every Christmas, and the way he never forgot anyone's birthday. Losing him felt like losing the one person who always knew exactly who I was. The reading of his will was supposed to be a quiet family affair. Instead, it changed everything. The attorney explained that my grandfather had left me the majority of his estate because I'd spent years helping him after my grandmother died. My cousins received generous gifts. My aunt inherited the lake cabin, and I inherited the family investment portfolio, several commercial properties, and enough savings to ensure I would never have to worry about money again. I remember staring at the papers in disbelief. Ethan squeezed my hand beneath the table. "I'm proud of you," he whispered. At the time, it sounded like love. Now I know it sounded like calculation. Nothing changed immediately. I stayed at my job as a financial analyst because I loved the work. We still drove the same car and lived in the same house. My grandfather had always warned me that sudden wealth revealed people's true character faster than anything else. He was right. Within weeks, Ethan started talking differently. We should move. We deserve better. Money should make money. He said those phrases so often they became part of our daily conversations. Then he introduced me to someone named Vanessa. She was polished, charming, and claimed to specialize in luxury real estate investments. According to Ethan, she'd helped several entrepreneurs multiply their wealth in just a few years. "I think you'll like her," he said one evening. "She's brilliant." She certainly acted like it. Vanessa spoke with effortless confidence. She complimented my grandfather's business decisions before she'd even seen the estate documents. She somehow knew details I hadn't shared with anyone outside the family attorney. At the time, I assumed Ethan had told her. Now I know that assumption cost me millions. She convinced us that several commercial buildings should be transferred into newly formed investment companies before the market shifted. I hesitated. Grandfather had always hated unnecessary complexity. Ethan laughed gently. "You're still thinking like someone who's afraid of money, instead of someone who owns it." It sounded supportive. It wasn't. Over the next several months, more documents appeared. Operating agreements, investment authorizations, temporary asset transfers. Every time I questioned something, Ethan had an answer. Tax strategy, asset protection. Legal restructuring. Whenever I wanted to speak with my grandfather's attorney, Ethan would smile. You're paying him by the hour. Why waste money? Asking questions we've already answered. I hate admitting this now, but I trusted my husband more than my instincts. Then small things began to feel wrong. Receipts disappeared. Passwords changed. Letters from the estate office stopped arriving at the house. Whenever I asked about them, Ethan insisted everything had gone digital. One Saturday afternoon, I walked into his home office without knocking. His laptop screen was still open. There was a photograph of Vanessa. Not a business profile, not a company website. A vacation photo. She was wearing the emerald necklace my grandmother had left me. My necklace. My husband hurried into the room so quickly he nearly knocked over his chair. He slammed the laptop shut before I could say a word. For the first time since we'd married, he looked afraid. And that was the moment I realized I wasn't just losing my inheritance. I was about to discover that my marriage had been built on a lie far bigger than stolen money. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Ethan rested one hand on the closed laptop, as if he were guarding something far more valuable than the computer itself. His breathing was steady, but his eyes kept drifting toward the screen, calculating whether I had seen enough to become dangerous. "What are you doing in here?" he finally asked. I almost laughed, not because anything was funny, but because he'd managed to sound offended while standing between me and a photograph of another woman wearing my grandmother's necklace. "I live here," I replied quietly. "So do I." He forced a smile. "You could have knocked. I've never had to knock before." He hesitated just long enough for the silence to become an answer. I looked at him for another few seconds before saying, "Why does Vanessa have my necklace?" His expression softened instantly, the way it always did whenever he wanted me to doubt myself. "It isn't your necklace. I know my grandmother's jewelry." "You're mistaken." "I'm not." He sighed dramatically, rubbing his temples as though I were exhausting him. "Vanessa tried on a similar necklace during a charity event a few weeks ago. Someone probably took a picture. You're jumping to conclusions." He delivered the explanation so smoothly that a year earlier I probably would have believed him. But something inside me had shifted. Not because of the necklace, because of the fear I'd seen in his eyes before he recovered. Fear doesn't appear without a reason. That evening I couldn't sleep. Ethan lay beside me as though nothing had happened, scrolling through his phone until nearly midnight before placing it face down on the nightstand. He'd never done that before. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to the faint glow of the bedroom door opening. I kept my breathing slow and even. Ethan picked up his phone and quietly left the room. A minute later, I heard the back door close. Curiosity finally overpowered hesitation. I slipped out of bed, wrapped a sweater around my shoulders, and followed him. He was standing on the back patio with his voice lowered. "I know she's suspicious," he whispered. A pause. "No, not yet." Another pause. "I'll get the rest signed before she figures it out." The words hit me harder than I expected, not because they confirmed my fears, because they destroyed the last excuse I had left for him. I stepped back before he could see me and returned to bed. When he came inside several minutes later, he slid beneath the blankets and wrapped an arm around my waist. "I love you," he whispered. I stared into the darkness until sunrise. Those 3 words had never sounded so empty. The next morning, I called my grandfather's attorney. The call went straight to voicemail. I tried again after lunch. Nothing. By evening, I received a text. I'm out of the country until next week. If it's urgent, we'll speak as soon as I return. That wasn't like him. Richard Hale had represented my grandfather for over 30 years. He answered every call, every email, every question. For him to disappear without warning felt wrong. I almost called again. Instead, I decided to visit the estate office in person the following morning. When I arrived, the receptionist looked confused. "I'm sorry," she said. "Mr. Hale resigned 3 weeks ago." I frowned. Resigned? Yes. No. There must be some mistake. He handled my grandfather's estate. "I'm afraid he no longer works here." My pulse quickened. Who took over his clients? She glanced toward a closed office door. Mr. Douglas Avery. The name meant nothing to me. A few minutes later, Mr. Avery invited me into his office. He couldn't have been much older than 40. His desk was immaculate. Every file was perfectly aligned. He greeted me with a polite smile that never reached his eyes. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Carter?" "I wanted to review my grandfather's estate documents." "Of course." He opened a folder already sitting on his desk, almost as if he'd been expecting me. "As you can see," he said, turning several pages toward me, "most of the transfers have already been completed." Transfers? The commercial properties. I never approved permanent transfers. He adjusted his glasses. "Our records indicate otherwise." He slid several signed documents across the desk. Every signature belonged to me, or at least it looked like mine. I stared at the pages, the loops, the slant, even the pressure marks. They were nearly identical, but they weren't mine. A chill crawled down my spine. I didn't sign these. Mr. Avery folded his hands. "Mrs. Carter, accusing someone of document fraud is a very serious allegation. I'm not accusing anyone." I looked him directly in the eye. "I'm telling you, these signatures are fake." For the first time, his expression changed. Not to surprise, to discomfort. Almost as though he'd hoped I would simply accept the paperwork and leave. He quickly regained his composure. "If you believe there has been an error, you're welcome to hire a handwriting expert." "I intend to." He nodded once. "Very well." As I gathered the documents, something caught my attention. A familiar logo was printed at the bottom of one page. It belonged to the holding company Ethan had convinced me to create 6 months earlier. I froze. One line listed the company's managing director. It wasn't my name. It wasn't Ethan's. It was Vanessa Reed. My husband's financial advisor wasn't just advising us. She legally controlled the company that now held most of my grandfather's commercial properties. I walked out of the building without remembering how I'd reached the parking lot. Sitting behind the steering wheel, I finally allowed myself to cry. Not because of the money, not because of the betrayal, but because I finally understood something my grandfather had once told me over a game of chess. When someone makes a move that looks too easy, never study the move, study the game. I wiped away my tears and looked back at the estate office through the windshield. Someone had forged my signature. Someone had replaced my grandfather's trusted attorney. Someone had quietly transferred my inheritance into a company controlled by my husband's mistress. And deep inside, I knew this conspiracy was far bigger than the two people sharing my bed and my fortune. I just didn't know that before the week was over. Someone would try to convince the police that I was the one who had committed the fraud. The detective didn't knock when he arrived. He rang the bell once, showed me his badge through the glass, and waited patiently while I opened the door. "Mrs. Carter?" "Yes, I'm Detective Owen Brooks." We need to ask you a few questions regarding several allegations of financial fraud involving the Arthur Bennett estate. For one brief moment, my heart stopped. Then it started again, slowly, steadily. My grandfather used to say, "Panic is expensive, calm costs nothing." I invited the detectives inside. Ethan had already left for work, or so I thought. As Detective Brooks explained, that anonymous evidence had been submitted accusing me of creating shell companies to hide estate assets. Another car pulled into the driveway. Ethan stepped out. He looked surprised to see the police. A convincing performance. Too convincing. He hurried toward the front door. "What's going on?" The detective turned. "Your wife is assisting us with an investigation." Ethan wrapped an arm around my shoulders. "I'll do whatever I can to help her." The gesture looked loving, to everyone except me. I could almost hear my grandfather's voice, reminding me that the best liars don't avoid the spotlight. They walk directly into it. The detectives asked about the investment companies, the transferred properties, and the signatures on dozens of legal documents. I answered every question honestly. Ethan answered every question confidently. There was a difference. Honesty remembers. Confidence performs. Before leaving, Detective Brooks handed me his business card. "If you remember anything else, call me." "I will." As soon as the door closed, Ethan's smile disappeared. "What exactly did you tell them?" "The truth." He stared at me for several seconds. "Good." It sounded less like reassurance and more like a warning. That afternoon, I drove somewhere Ethan never expected me to visit, my grandfather's old lake cabin. It had been left to my Aunt Eleanor, but she still kept one room exactly as my grandfather had left it. His desk, his books, his chessboard, his habits. She welcomed me without asking questions. "You look tired." "I am." She poured tea into two old ceramic mugs before quietly saying, "Your grandfather told me this day might come." I nearly dropped my cup. "What?" "He never trusted sudden wealth." She stood, walked toward an old bookshelf, and reached behind a row of weathered history books. Her fingers pulled out a small brass key attached to a faded leather tag. "I was only supposed to give this to you if you ever said someone had betrayed your trust." I stared at the key. "What does it open?" "A safe deposit box." "Why didn't he tell me?" "Because he hoped you'd never need it." The following morning, I stood inside the oldest bank in town. The manager personally escorted me downstairs. When the heavy steel box slid open, I expected jewelry, cash, maybe family photographs. Instead, there was a single envelope on the front, written in my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting, were 7 words: "Open only if someone steals from you." My hands trembled as I unfolded the letter. "My dearest Emma, if you're reading this, then someone has confused your kindness with weakness. I prayed that would never happen, but I prepared anyway." Tears blurred my vision. Inside the envelope were copies of documents I had never seen. Every property deed, every trust agreement, every corporate filing, every original signature. More importantly, there was a notarized letter explaining that none of the commercial properties could ever be permanently transferred without a biometric verification recorded by the family attorney and the estate trustee. That verification had never taken place, which meant every transfer was legally defective. Every single one. There was also a flash drive. The bank manager allowed me to review its contents in a private office. The first video appeared on the screen. My grandfather, recorded 6 months before he died. "If anyone ever tells you these properties belong to someone else, They're lying. I've designed this estate so that anyone attempting to steal from you leaves a trail too obvious to erase. He smiled the same warm smile I'd known my entire life. Greedy people always rush. Patient people let greed expose itself. The remaining files contained copies of emails between the estate office and my grandfather. One name appeared repeatedly: Richard Hale. My grandfather's attorney had anticipated the possibility of fraud years before his death. He had quietly duplicated every critical document and placed them in the safe deposit box as insurance. Suddenly, everything became clear. Richard hadn't abandoned the estate. Someone had forced him out after my grandfather died because he knew too much. Armed with the originals, I contacted Detective Brooks immediately. Within 48 hours, handwriting experts confirmed my signatures had been forged. Digital forensic specialists traced the fraudulent document edits to a computer registered under Douglas Avery's law office. Financial investigators followed the money. Millions of dollars had moved through shell companies before landing in accounts jointly controlled by Vanessa Reed and Ethan Carter. The arrests happened on a rainy Tuesday morning. Neighbors stood outside watching as investigators carried boxes of evidence from my house. Ethan looked at me one last time before officers placed him in the back of a police vehicle. "I loved you," he said. I met his eyes without anger. "No," I answered quietly. "You loved what belonged to me." Vanessa accepted a plea agreement that required her to testify against everyone involved. Douglas Avery lost his law license before facing criminal charges. Richard Hale eventually returned. He had resigned because he refused to certify fraudulent transfers and had been threatened with professional ruin if he stayed. My inheritance was fully restored. Every property, every investment, even my grandmother's emerald necklace found its way back to me after investigators recovered it from a private jewelry vault rented under Vanessa's name. Months later, I returned to my grandfather's grave carrying that necklace in my pocket. "I finally understand," I whispered. "You never left me money. You left me wisdom." A gentle breeze rustled the trees around the cemetery. For the first time since Ethan walked into my life, I felt completely free. I didn't win because I was richer. I didn't win because I was luckier. I won because I refused to let betrayal decide who I became. Justice didn't arrive overnight, but when it finally arrived, it collected every debt. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If this story kept you guessing, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What was the biggest red flag Ethan showed that Emma should never have ignored? Share your answer in the comments. If you enjoyed this journey of betrayal, patience, and earned justice, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more stories, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next unforgettable tale from the Bitter Ledger.